Beneath the golden hills of California, hidden under freeways and shopping malls and millions of sleeping people, lies a crack in the earth more than 800 miles long. It runs the length of the state like a scar, from the deserts near the Mexican border all the way up to the misty forests north of San Francisco. Most of the people living on top of it have no idea it is there. They drive over it on their morning commute. They build their homes across it. They sleep soundly above a fault line that has been quietly loading up with energy for over a century, storing the force of 1,000 explosions, waiting for the moment it finally lets go. This is the San Andreas Fault, and it is not a question of whether it will snap. It is only a question of when. When it does, and scientists agree it is overdue, it will not be a gentle rumble. It will be one of the most violent natural events in the history of the modern United States. The ground will not simply shake. In some places, it will lurch sideways by 30 feet in a matter of seconds, tearing apart everything built across it. Highways will split. Water pipelines will rupture. Gas lines will explode. And here is the part almost nobody thinks about. The very things that connect California to the rest of the world, the roads, the power lines, the aqueducts that carry water across the desert, all of them cross the fault. And when the fault moves, it cuts them, all at once. Which means that in the crucial hours after the disaster, some cities will be completely cut off. No water flowing in, no power, no open roads, no help arriving from outside. Just the survivors, alone, waiting for a rescue that cannot reach them. In this video, we are going to walk through 7 cities that sit directly in the path of catastrophe. 7 places where, when the San Andreas finally snaps, help will not come in time. We will look at why each one is so dangerously exposed, what would happen in the first terrifying minutes, and why the geography that made these cities possible could also be the thing that seals their fate. Some of these names you will recognize instantly, others you have probably never heard of, and yet they may be the most vulnerable of all. Stay until the end, because the last city on this list faces a threat so specific and so overlooked that even many of the people who live there do not understand the danger sitting right beneath their feet. Hashtag the monster under California. Before we get to the cities, you need to understand what the San Andreas actually is, because most people picture it wrong. It is not a bottomless canyon that will swallow California and drop it into the ocean. That is a myth from the movies. The truth is stranger, and, in its own way, more frightening. The San Andreas is what geologists call a transform fault. It is the boundary between 2 enormous slabs of the Earth's crust, the Pacific Plate on one side and the North American Plate on the other. These 2 plates are grinding past each other, sideways, in opposite directions. The Pacific Plate, which carries places like Los Angeles, is slowly creeping northwest. The North American Plate is moving the other way. Over millions of years, this grinding motion has shaped the entire landscape of California, raising mountains, carving valleys, and building the coastline we know today. But the plates do not slide smoothly. They are locked together by friction, jammed against each other like 2 enormous sheets of sandpaper pressed face to face. And while they are locked, the deep forces driving them do not stop. The pressure keeps building. The rock bends and strains and stores that energy, year after year, decade after decade, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. Eventually, the friction gives way. The rock snaps back into place all at once, releasing a century of stored energy in a matter of seconds. That sudden release is an earthquake. The southern section of the San Andreas is the one that terrifies scientists the most. It has not produced a truly great earthquake in more than 300 years. 3 centuries of pressure. 3 centuries of energy quietly accumulating with nowhere to go. When that section finally releases, experts have modeled the result in chilling detail. They call it the Big One, and the most studied scenario describes a rupture that begins near the Salton Sea in the south and tears northward for more than 200 miles, unzipping the fault in about 2 minutes of unimaginable violence. The shaking would last far longer than the brief jolts most people have felt. In the worst hit areas, the ground could heave and roll for a full minute or more, long enough for buildings that survived the first shock to finally give up and collapse, and the destruction would not stay near the fault. The energy would radiate outward, funneling through the soft sedimentary basins that cradle California's biggest cities. These basins act like bowls of jelly, trapping and amplifying the seismic waves, shaking the buildings on top of them far harder and far longer than solid bedrock ever would. So even a city sitting miles from the fault itself could be hammered mercilessly, its skyscrapers swaying, its older buildings crumbling, its lifelines torn apart. There is one more thing you need to understand about this fault, and it is the reason scientists speak about it with such urgency. Great earthquakes on the San Andreas are not random. They happen in a rough rhythm, a cycle that geologists have pieced together by digging into the fault and reading the layers of disturbed earth left behind by ancient quakes. Those layers tell a story stretching back thousands of years, and the story is consistent. The southern San Andreas has produced a major earthquake, on average, every century or two throughout its recorded history, and the last one on that critical southern stretch struck roughly 300 years ago. In other words, by the fault's own long-established rhythm, the region is not just due for a great earthquake. It is well past due. Every year that passes without a rupture is not a year of safety. It is another year of energy piling up, another turn of the spring, making the eventual release only larger and more violent when it finally comes. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath the sunny surface of California life. The big one is not a distant hypothetical or a disaster movie fantasy. It is a near certainty that the state's own geology guarantees. An event that scientists can describe in extraordinary detail, even though they cannot say precisely which day it will arrive. It could be decades away. It could be tomorrow. And when it comes, the cities we are about to visit will have front row seats to the most powerful natural disaster their region has ever faced. Now that you understand the monster, let us meet the cities that live closest to its jaws. Hashtag number 7. Palm Springs and the trap of the Coachella Valley. We begin in the desert, in a place famous for luxury resorts, swimming pools, and endless sunshine. Palm Springs and the surrounding Coachella Valley sit in one of the most beautiful and most dangerous locations in all of California. Because the southern San Andreas Fault runs directly along the edge of this valley, skirting the base of the mountains that give the region its dramatic backdrop. This is precisely where scientists believe the next great rupture is most likely to begin. The southernmost section of the fault, the part that has been silent for 3 centuries, passes right through this region. When it lets go, the communities of the Coachella Valley would be among the very first to feel it, and they would feel it at full force, right at the source, before the energy had a chance to weaken as it traveled. The problem for Palm Springs and its neighbors is not just the shaking, it is isolation. This is a desert valley, ringed by mountains, connected to the rest of Southern California by a handful of highways and mountain passes. Those passes are exactly the kind of terrain that fails catastrophically in a major quake. Landslides would bury the roads, bridges and overpasses could pancake. The valley could find itself sealed off, a bowl of destruction with the routes in and out choked with rubble. And then there is the water. This is a desert. It receives almost no rainfall, and much of its water and power arrives through infrastructure that crosses the fault zone. Sever those lifelines, and you have hundreds of thousands of people in a scorching desert with no reliable water, no power for air conditioning, and no easy way for help to reach them. In the brutal desert heat, that combination is not just uncomfortable, it is deadly. Palm Springs may be the glittering playground of the desert, but when the San Andreas begins its rupture, it could become one of the first places where survivors are left entirely on their own. Hashtag number 6. Indio and the forgotten communities of the East Valley. Just down the road from Palm Springs lies a cluster of cities that get far less attention but face an even harsher version of the same nightmare. Indio and the eastern Coachella Valley are home to large working communities, sprawling agricultural operations, and a population that swells enormously during festival season. When hundreds of thousands of visitors pour into the area for some of the largest outdoor events in the country, imagine the timing at its worst. The fault ruptures during one of those massive gatherings, when the desert is packed with people who do not live there, who do not know the area, and who have no supplies, no shelter, and no idea where to go. The roads that brought them in would be destroyed. The temporary infrastructure would collapse. and the same isolation that threatens Palm Springs would trap this crowd in the desert with almost no way out. Even on an ordinary day, the Eastern Valley is uniquely exposed. Many of its communities were built quickly and cheaply, and older structures in particular are vulnerable to the kind of prolonged, violent shaking a great San Andreas earthquake would deliver. Emergency services in these areas are stretched thin even in normal times. After the big one, with roads gone and communications down, the region could wait days for meaningful outside help to arrive. In a place where summer temperatures routinely climb past 115 degrees, days without water or power is not a hardship. It is a death sentence for the most vulnerable. Indio and its neighbors represent the quiet tragedy of the San Andreas, the places that will suffer terribly and yet are rarely part of the conversation. Hashtag number 5. San Bernardino and the Cajon Pass chokepoint. Now, we move to a city whose danger comes not just from the fault beneath it, but from a single critical mountain pass nearby that holds the fate of all of Southern California in its grip. San Bernardino sits at the foot of towering mountains, in a region where the San Andreas Fault carves a dramatic path through the landscape. Just to the north lies the Cajon Pass, one of the most important and most terrifyingly vulnerable pieces of geography in the entire western United States. Through this narrow mountain gap runs a staggering concentration of lifelines, a major interstate highway, critical railroad lines that carry goods across the country, aqueducts carrying water, natural gas pipelines, electrical transmission lines. Almost everything that flows between Southern California and the rest of the nation squeezes through this one passage, and the San Andreas Fault runs directly across it. When the fault snaps, the ground in the Cajon Pass could shift by many feet in an instant, shearing through every single one of those lifelines simultaneously. The highway would be split and buckled. The rail lines would be torn apart. The pipelines carrying fuel and gas could rupture and ignite. The aqueducts would crack and drain. In one violent moment, the main artery connecting Southern California to the outside world would be severed. Supplies, fuel, and aid that would normally flow in along these routes would simply stop. For San Bernardino itself, sitting right in this danger zone, the shaking would be ferocious. But the deeper catastrophe is what the severed pass means for millions of people downstream. The region imports the majority of its water from hundreds of miles away, and much of it travels through corridors like this one. Cut the pass, and you have not just damaged one city. You have begun to strangle an entire metropolis. San Bernardino is the choke point, the place where the lifelines of a civilization come together in the one spot where the earth is most likely to tear them apart. Hashtag number 4. Palmdale and the fault that runs through Townhead to the high desert north of Los Angeles, and you find a city built almost literally on top of the beast. In the Palmdale area, the San Andreas Fault is not some distant line in the wilderness. It runs right through the region, so close and so visible that geologists use the dramatic rock formations here to study the fault directly. You can stand in places where the very ground has been twisted, folded, and lifted by millions of years of relentless movement. Living this close to the fault means that when it ruptures, there is no buffer, no distance, no mercy. The ground displacement, that sudden sideways lurch of many feet, could pass directly through developed areas. Anything built across the fault line, roads, pipelines, buildings, would be ripped in two as the two sides of the earth slide past each other. This is the most direct form of earthquake destruction, and few populated places in California are more exposed to it. But Palmdale carries an additional, hidden danger that makes it especially critical. This area is a crucial junction for the aqueduct system that carries water south to the enormous population of the Los Angeles basin. Some of the most important water infrastructure in the state crosses the fault at or near this region. When the fault moves, these aqueducts, which cannot bend or flex enough to survive a sudden 30-foot shift, would be severed. In a single moment, a major share of the water supply for millions of people to the south would be cut off, potentially for months, because repairing an aqueduct that has been torn apart by fault movement in rugged terrain is a slow and grueling process. So Palmdale faces a double blow. It sits directly on the rupture, guaranteeing severe local destruction. And it holds the water lifelines whose failure would cripple the megacity to the south. It is a small city with an outsized role in the coming catastrophe, and when help is needed most, this region will likely be too broken to provide it and too damaged to receive it. Hashtag number 3. Los Angeles and the city that cannot be reached. And now we arrive at the giant. Los Angeles is one of the largest urban regions on the planet, home to millions upon millions of people spread across a vast basin of freeways, neighborhoods, and towering downtown skyscrapers. And while the San Andreas Fault does not run through the heart of the city, that fact offers far less protection than you might hope. Here is the terrifying reality of Los Angeles. The city sits in a deep sedimentary basin, that giant bowl of soft soil we talked about earlier. When the seismic waves from a great San Andreas rupture come rolling in from the north and east, that basin will catch them, trap them, and amplify them. The shaking in parts of Los Angeles could be far stronger and far longer than the distance from the fault would suggest. Tall buildings would sway violently for a minute or more. Older concrete structures, and the region has many of them, could collapse. Freeway overpasses could give way. But the true horror for Los Angeles is not just the shaking. It is the aftermath of isolation. Remember all those severed lifelines. The aqueducts crossing the fault at Palmdale and elsewhere, cut. The interstate lifelines through the Cajon Pass, cut. The natural gas and fuel lines feeding the region, ruptured. Los Angeles imports the overwhelming majority of its water from far away, and nearly every one of those water routes crosses the San Andreas Fault. In the scenario scientists have modeled, the region could lose most of its imported water in an instant, and the local supplies would not last long against the needs of millions of people. Now add fire to the picture. When the shaking ruptures thousands of gas lines across the basin at the same moment, fires ignite everywhere, and when the water mains have been shattered by the same quake, the fire hydrants run dry. Firefighters would face an impossible situation. A city burning in countless places at once with little water to fight it. In past great earthquakes, it was fire, not the shaking itself, that caused the most devastation, and Los Angeles is uniquely primed for exactly that nightmare. Help from outside would struggle to arrive because the roads leading into the region would be broken and jammed. The airports would be damaged. The ports could be crippled. A city of millions could be left, for days, to fend for itself while the water runs out and the fires spread. Los Angeles will not vanish into the sea, but large parts of it could become unreachable, unlivable, and unrescuable in the crucial window when survival matters most. Hashtag number 2. Daly City and the edge of the peninsula. Now we travel hundreds of miles north, to a city that has the dubious honor of being one of the places where the San Andreas Fault is most intimate with human habitation. Daly City, perched on the coast just south of San Francisco, sits so close to the fault that in some spots, the boundary between the two great plates of the earth runs almost through the neighborhoods themselves. The fault comes ashore in this region and slices right along the edge of the peninsula. This is the northern segment of the San Andreas, the same section that produced the catastrophic earthquake that destroyed much of San Francisco more than a century ago. That historic quake, one of the most famous natural disasters in American history, was caused by a rupture along this very stretch of fault. The energy released reshaped the region and leveled a great city, and the fault has been quietly reloading ever since. For Daly City and the communities strung along this part of the coast, the danger is proximity in its purest form. Being this close to the fault means experiencing the maximum intensity of ground shaking and the direct threat of surface rupture. Homes and roads built across or near the fault trace would face the full force of the earth tearing sideways, and the peninsula geography creates its own trap. It is a narrow strip of land, densely developed, connected to the surrounding region by highways and bridges that would be severely tested by a major quake. Landslides along the coastal bluffs, which are already prone to erosion, could take out roads and homes alike. When the northern San Andreas finally releases its stored energy again, the communities clinging to this beautiful, treacherous edge of California would be among the first and hardest hit, with the ocean on one side and a torn fault on the other. Hashtag number 1. San Francisco and the ghost of a great disaster, and so we come to the top of our list, to a city whose very history is written in the language of earthquakes. San Francisco is one of the most iconic cities in the world, a place of steep hills, gleaming towers, and one of the most famous bridges on Earth. It is also a city that has already been destroyed once by the San Andreas Fault, and everything about its situation suggests it remains dangerously exposed to a repeat. The great earthquake that struck this region long ago did not just topple buildings. The shaking ruptured gas lines and the fires that followed burned for days, consuming huge swaths of the city while firefighters watched helplessly, their water mains shattered and their hydrants dry. It was one of the deadliest and most destructive disasters the nation had ever seen. And it happened because of a rupture on the very same fault system that still runs right past the city today. That fault has been silent for well over a century, and all the while the pressure has been building once again. Modern San Francisco is far larger, far taller, and far more crowded than the city that burned before. Much of its most valuable real estate sits on filled land, ground that was created by dumping earth and rubble into what used to be the bay. This artificial ground behaves horrifically in an earthquake, when violently shaken. Saturated, loose soil can lose its strength entirely and behave like a liquid, a phenomenon that causes buildings to sink, tilt, and topple. The very neighborhoods that suffered the worst in the historic quake, the ones built on made ground, would likely suffer the worst again. And San Francisco faces the same brutal isolation as the rest. It is a city on the tip of a peninsula, dependent on bridges and a small number of routes to connect it to the wider region. Its water travels from distant mountains through pipelines that cross the fault. When the northern San Andreas releases the energy it has been hoarding for more than 100 years, San Francisco could face shattered water systems, widespread fires with no water to fight them, collapsed structures on liquefied ground, and severed connections to the outside world. It is the city that history warns us about most clearly, the place that has already shown exactly how this story ends. And yet, millions live there today, going about their lives above a fault that is more overdue with every passing year. When help is needed most, a broken and burning San Francisco may find that help cannot cross the water, cannot cross the fault, and cannot arrive in time. Hashtag the first 72 hours. To truly understand why these cities are so vulnerable, you have to imagine the timeline of the disaster as it actually unfolds, minute by minute, hour by hour. Because the story of a great earthquake is not just the moment of shaking, it is everything that comes after, in the long, dark hours, when the survivors are waiting and the help is not coming. In the first 60 seconds, the ground does its violence. Buildings that were going to fall, overpasses that were going to buckle, pipelines snap, gas escapes. And the first fires flicker to life. When the shaking finally stops, an eerie quiet settles over the landscape, broken only by car alarms, breaking glass, and the distant wail of the first sirens. And in that quiet, the survivors begin to realize the true scale of what has happened. The power is out. The lights are dark across entire regions. The cell towers, overwhelmed and damaged, stop working, and suddenly people cannot reach their loved ones, cannot call for help, cannot even find out what has happened beyond their own street. In the first hour, the emergency response begins, but it collides immediately with the reality of the severed lifelines. Fire trucks race toward burning buildings, only to find the roads blocked by rubble and the hydrants dry. Ambulances cannot reach the injured because the freeways are broken and the surface streets are gridlocked with panicked, fleeing people. Hospitals, many of them damaged by the shaking themselves, are flooded with casualties they cannot possibly treat all at once. And the professionals who make up the emergency response, the firefighters and paramedics and police, are stretched impossibly thin because a disaster of this scale does not create one emergency. It creates tens of thousands of them, all at the same moment, spread across a region the size of a small country. By the end of the first day, the outside world is desperate to help. Rescue teams from other states begin to mobilize. Supplies are gathered. But then comes the cruel bottleneck. How do you get in? The airports may have cracked runways. The ports may have damaged docks. The highways, the ones that cross the fault, are severed at the crossing points. Every route into the disaster zone has been compromised by the same event that created the need for rescue. And so the aid piles up at the edges of the catastrophe, close but unable to reach the people who need it most. This is the moment the survivors have been warned about, the gap between the disaster and the arrival of meaningful help. It is a gap that can stretch not for hours, but for days. In the second and third days, the situation grows more desperate for those still trapped in the hardest hit zones. Without running water, thirst becomes a genuine threat, especially in the scorching desert cities of the south. Without power, refrigeration fails and food spoils. Without communication, rumors spread and fear grows. Aftershocks, some of them powerful earthquakes in their own right, continue to rattle the already weakened buildings, bringing down structures that survived the first blow and terrifying a population already pushed to its limit. This is the true meaning of the phrase, before help arrives. It is not an abstraction. It is 72 hours or more of survivors relying on nothing but what they have, what their neighbors have, and their own will to endure. Hashtag the long shadow, and even when help finally does arrive, the story is far from over. A great earthquake on the San Andreas would not be a single bad day that the region recovers from in a week. It would cast a shadow that stretches for years, reshaping the lives of everyone it touched. Consider the water. When the aqueducts that cross the fault are torn apart, they cannot simply be patched overnight. Repairing major water infrastructure that has been severed by fault movement, often in remote and rugged terrain, is a monumental engineering task that can take many months. During all that time, cities of millions would be surviving on emergency supplies and whatever local reserves they can muster. Rationing every drop, unable to return to anything resembling normal life. A modern city cannot function without water, and the prospect of a great metropolis limping along for months on a fraction of its normal supply is one of the most sobering aspects of the entire scenario. Then there is the economy. These 7 cities and the regions around them represent an enormous share of one of the largest economies on the planet. When they are crippled, the damage does not stay local. Ports that handle a vast portion of the nation's imported goods could be knocked offline, disrupting supply chains across the entire country and beyond. Businesses would be destroyed, jobs lost, and the cost of rebuilding would climb into figures so large they are difficult to comprehend. The financial aftershocks of the big one would ripple outward across the nation and the world, long after the ground stopped moving. And there is the human cost that never fully heals. Communities scattered, homes lost, families changed forever by a single afternoon when the earth reminded everyone who is really in charge. History shows that great cities do rebuild after great earthquakes. San Francisco rose again from its ashes, grander than before. But the rebuilding takes a generation, and the memory lingers far longer. The people who lived through the big one would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, and the cities they rebuild would forever bear the marks of the day the fault finally snapped. Hashtag the race against the clock, so there they are. 7 cities, from the deserts of the south to the fog-shrouded coast of the north, each one standing in the path of the same slumbering giant. Palm Springs and Indio, trapped in an isolated desert valley right at the likely starting point of the rupture. San Bernardino, guarding the fatal chokepoint of the Cajon Pass. Palmdale, straddling the fault and holding the water lifelines of a metropolis. Los Angeles, a giant that cannot be reached when its lifelines are cut and its basin traps the shaking. Daly City, clinging to the very edge of the fault. And San Francisco, haunted by a disaster it has already lived through once. What ties all of them together is not just the shaking. It is the cruel mathematics of a great earthquake striking a modern, interconnected society. Our cities are kept alive by invisible threads. The water, the power, the fuel, the roads, the communications. All flowing in from somewhere else. And in California, an astonishing number of those threads must cross the San Andreas Fault to reach the people who depend on them. When the fault moves, it does not politely cut one thread at a time. It severs them all at once, in the same violent instant, across hundreds of miles. That is why help will struggle to arrive. The very act that creates the emergency also destroys the pathways that rescue would travel. Emergency planners understand this better than anyone, and it is why they repeat the same urgent message over and over. In the first days after the big one, you may be on your own. The roads may be gone, The stores may be empty and unreachable. The taps may be dry. The phones may be dead. Outside help, no matter how desperately it is trying to reach you, may simply not be able to get through. Not for hours, not for days, perhaps longer. The heroes of the first response will not be distant rescuers arriving in convoys. They will be ordinary neighbors, helping each other out of the rubble, sharing water, and surviving together until the outside world can finally break through. Hashtag living on the faulted would be easy to end this by saying these cities are doomed. But that is not the truth, and it is not the point. The San Andreas will snap. That much is certain. The plates will keep grinding, the pressure will keep building, and one day the ground will heave, and these 7 cities, along with the many millions of people who call them home, will face the most severe test of their existence. But whether they vanish or endure is not written in stone. The difference between catastrophe and survival lies in the choices made long before the shaking starts. It lies in buildings reinforced to sway instead of collapse. It lies in water systems designed with flexible joints that can bend across a moving fault instead of snapping. It lies in families who keep enough water and supplies to last a week or more without any outside help. It lies in communities that know their neighbors and have a plan for the day the lifelines fail. The Earth has given California a warning that stretches back through its entire recorded history. A warning written in the ruins of past disasters and in the silent, straining rock beneath the ground. The people of these 7 cities live every day on top of one of the most powerful forces on the planet, a slow-motion collision between 2 pieces of the Earth's crust that has been unfolding for millions of years and will not stop for anyone. Most of them never think about it. The sun shines, the freeways hum, life goes on. But deep below, the spring keeps winding tighter. And somewhere down there, in the dark locked rock of the southern San Andreas, the countdown to the big one is already running. The only question that remains is whether, when the day finally comes,